Control should be separated into three rights: the right to represent, the right to act, and the right to train. Because hijacked avatar can issue false statements, for example, or make commitments on behalf of the company. So who can feed your messages, recordings, behaviors, etc. into a system, and for what purposes? Most people assume consent is obvious, but digital identity, data, AI representations, they don't just sit there waiting to be transferred.
What should I be looking for when it comes to signing those agreements? Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Niki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. And welcome back to another episode of the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. My guest today is Malvika. Malvika, I connected with you on LinkedIn because you have an interesting background, but one that I'm fascinated with, which is how HR and digital legacy intersect. You wrote an article about digital legacy. So welcome to the show. And how did you get so interested, not just in the HRS aspect, but the digital piece?
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, Nikki. So I have spent most of my career in human resources, although I started my career in accounting and finance, but I've always been interested, because of my HR background, in the ethical and responsible use of technology. So when AI, specifically Gen AI, entered the public consciousness a few years ago, right after ChatGPT came out, I realized that I needed to know everything about it because it was going to disrupt my profession. And in the process of educating myself on AI, I realized very quickly what the implications are when we don't have ethical and responsible AI considerations and we don't have proper governance. So that's what got me interested in this topic.
Well, I think that that's the intersection you and I share together, that passion of like, how is this going to affect us? For you, it's from the employee. And for me, I'm fascinated with the employee because the employee, the most humanistic thing we'll ever experience is death, dying, and incapacitation. And from an employer standpoint, when you have an employee that's managing that, it's going to affect their productivity, absenteeism, turnover. Human-centric. How do we find this balance between how AI is enabling and the human aspect of we're still going through our human experience and our struggles?
First of all, when an employee experiences death or incapacitation in their life, as you said, it's an extremely difficult but also vulnerable time for the employee. It can also end up being a difficult time for the team, precisely because of the reasons you mentioned. Someone's going through a hard time. That stress does spill over into the team. Typically, they're taking on more, and at times even supporting that employee in terms of providing moral support. And so I think the first step is just to recognize that is what's happening, and to understand that we may have policies in place for situations like that, and yet every situation is very different. And there will be times when we will need to perhaps deviate from policy to accommodate an employee. I had a situation a few years ago when I was working as a CHRO. We had an employee who lost a loved one, and I had just joined this company, and the company had, I believe it was a 3-day bereavement leave policy. And this employee had lost their loved one in a different country. And so to attend the funeral and to be with their family during this difficult time would have required a 10 to 12-hour flight. And so 3 days would not have been enough. This employee would have needed, about a week. And the manager of the employee continued to insist that this is the bereavement leave policy and this is what we're going to give them. They get 3 days and they need to figure it out. And of course, after I had a conversation with the manager to understand why he was so adamant about this, I understood that he had grown up in a business world where there was no flex. And the policy was the policy, and that was it. And he was applying that same rubric to this new employee-centric, human-centric world we find ourselves in. Of course, we reached an understanding and we were able to extend the leave to 1 week for that employee, and we were able to even update our policy to reflect the fact that if you have to travel internationally, you get more bereavement leave. And so I say all of that to come back to your question about what does it mean to be human-centric. I think during a time like this, what it means is, yes, you have policies and procedures to support the employee and to provide support in a fair and equitable manner compared to other employees. But these are also times when you have to preserve the humanness and the dignity of the employees beyond looking to preserve your legacy policies and the fidelity of those policies.
I mean, as we're stepping into this, it feels that companies are scrambling to integrate AI solutions. I know many companies are strong arming their workforce staff to be working with Copilot, Microsoft Copilot. And is it the feeling that we'll become not obsolete, but I mean, the workforce reduction and the willingness to work with the human needs might become less valuable? That human equity piece I'm kind of playing around with here. Like, how do we find that balance? How do we support our human employees while embracing the new technology that's there to make us more productive and efficient?
So I was listening to the Microsoft Work Lab podcast a couple of months ago, and I stumbled upon this episode where they were interviewing, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was talking about, he wrote a book called Irreplaceable. And in it, he talks about this idea of humics, which are the uniquely human capabilities that differentiate us from AI and from machines. And he talked about three of them. The first one being creative thinking, meaning the ability to come up with new and novel ideas, not creativity in the AI sense where it sort of remixes old ideas and regurgitates what you've given it. The second thing that he talked about was critical thinking. So the ability to ask powerful questions, to frame problems, to ask the second order questions, to think about the ethical implications of an action, for example. And the third thing he talked about was social authenticity. So how we show up with each other. Our ability to form genuine human to human connection is one of the things that makes us human, right? And so he talked about how if we want to become irreplaceable in the age of AI, these are the three qualities or traits that we need to cultivate or skills that we need to hone. And he talks about the idea that these are things that we're born with. So he gives the example of when you watch children playing on a playground, you can see these skills show up. So kids will invent games out of nowhere, right? And come up with the rules and everything. That's creativity at play. Then, if someone deviates from the rules, or if a new rule needs to be introduced, they'll talk about it, they'll frame the problem. That's creative thinking, critical thinking. And when a new child enters or walks onto the playground and they invite that child to join them, that's social authenticity. That's them forming genuine human to human bonds. And so he talks about how somewhere along the way we lose these skills because we're in pursuit of efficiency. And that's what we've built organizations around as well. And so, coming back to your question about how do we find the balance, I think employers, the AI train has left the station. Yes, we need to learn AI. In fact, it's an important skill to future proof our careers. But I think the way that employers can find that balance is to help employees cultivate these genuinely human skills that make us who we are.
And then from there, it's how do we move through our days, right? Where the AI doesn't necessarily have to deal with caregiving for aging parents or special need children. And yet we still have this level of productivity that we need to conduct. I just find it fascinating that we are, really in an interesting stage right now is bringing our knowledge into an organization and for them to memorialize information that we've contributed to the team. Um, have you had experience as far as like we talked about guardrails and data access and risk management? Where do you see in the HR space and the conversations that those teams are having, bringing it into from the employee standpoint?
So, what I've observed is most employers and HR teams are not having that conversation. So just to give folks who are listening who don't understand what's going on, just to give them some context, Gartner has predicted that by next year, 70% of employment contracts for new hires will contain licensing and fair usage clauses for AI
Wow.
representations of their personas. And
Wow.
so, yes, and so
That's huge.
absolutely. And so if you think about what does that mean from a governance perspective and a policy perspective, right? We are now, as HR professionals, we will now need to start thinking about things like what are the terms and conditions that govern the use of these AI personas, these AI avatars of our employees. So, and what does that mean from a compensation and rewards perspective? So, for example, if my employer has created an AI avatar of me and I am embedding my knowledge and expertise and wisdom into that avatar, right? And that avatar is back at the office giving a presentation while I'm here having a meeting with you. Do I get paid twice for that? If my avatar is used to train my replacement or to train other people after I leave the company, do I get paid for that? Or what if my employer uses my avatar to say something that I would never ever say as a human? And so these are the things that we are going to have to think about from a governance and policy perspective. And going back to your question about human centricity, we're going to have to think about how do we put the human at the center of all of this, and how do we give them the knowledge and the rights to make decisions about how their likeness and their avatar is used. And by the way, if an employer is gathering face and voice data, that takes us into the biometric territory. So if you're gathering that type of data to create an employee's avatar, in the US, for example, that can trigger laws like Illinois' Biometric Information Privacy Act, whereby residents of Illinois, where I live, have recourse to control their own, fingerprints, facial scans, and other kind of information about their bodies. Denmark recently released a law that protects, that gives people copyright to their likeness. So these are the types of things that we will need to think about as we gather this data to create people's avatars. And it's already happening. Zoom had an earnings call last year where their CEO, I think his name is Eric Wan, anyway, their CEO showed up to the earnings call, but before the human CEO showed up, his avatar showed up for the first part of the earnings call, and talked about the recent earnings and gave a presentation. So these are things that are already happening in the business world.
They are, and I've personally experienced it. And you kind of have me like having a pause here. It's a bit like catching my breath. The technology, the use cases, the risk, the implications. I am just having a moment here of where do we go from here? Like, and I'm thinking about the implications of the licensing of an avatar of an employee that is no longer there, either physically no longer there because they've left the company, or no longer around because they've left this
Mm-hmm.
plane of existence.
Yes.
Who owns that data? Who's benefiting from the data? And we're back to that same common denominator, which is that data sovereignty. Like how our legacy lives on, whether we choose for it to not be here. There's no off switch.
You're absolutely right. And I believe this is why we need to start having conversations with our loved ones about how we want our data to be used, whether we want our data to be used in the future, because you could even have sort of IP and intellectual property and institutional memory disputes. So if a company, let's say in the example that you gave, where you have an employee who has passed, the company may want to extract the tacit knowledge and the know-how and the wisdom of that expert, but you could have disputes over intellectual capital when companies want to preserve expertise, but families want boundaries. And so then you end up in this contractual confusion arena, because very few employment agreements, none that I know of, clearly define post-employment or post-death use of AI representations.
I mean, we could barely get our data privacy laws straightened out. I mean,
Yes.
GDPR, when the GDPR was, released in 2018, there was no language in there about postmortem. It was really, about present day if you're alive today, and not about deleting, whether you were deceased. So now we're just taking it, feels like, we're taking it 3 or 4 more levels down, where whether you're alive or dead, that the company is going to own your likeness. They're going to own your knowledge base. The family, they're grieving their loved one. How do they even step into, much less financially support, legislate, legal actions against? I'm just, my head spinning at the moment. I don't even know where to go with this conversation to kind of bring us back up to the level, that humanistic level of like Pandora's box, like the genie's out of the bottle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's not just about our passwords anymore. This is about our loved ones' expertise, knowledge base, and companies continue to monetize on it long after the person is gone.
Yes, and you make a really good point, which is that most employers have access governance, right? So you have offboarding checklists, you have your access to certain systems gets turned off, you return your devices. But what we will need in the future is identity governance, right? For the era of avatars and agents and synthetic personas. What we haven't talked about yet is you also need to understand impersonation and fraud risk, right? We've all read these stories about, there was a case last year where someone made a deep fake of a CEO and called up the company's CFO and asked them to wire $10 million to somewhere. And the CFO followed the instructions because it sounded like the CEO. And so impersonation and fraud risk is also on the rise. So hijacked avatar can issue false statements, for example, or fabricate evidence, or make commitments on behalf of the company. You so you have to, I think, start thinking about incapacity and death as an operational risk. And I think the data privacy and security teams will need a playbook that covers things like avatar shutdown, avatar rights, delegated authority, limits, post-employment use, dispute resolution. So these are all things that we will need to start to understand and incorporate into how we govern these AI personas.
I'm just thinking of the bereaved wife whose husband was killed in a car crash. Like, how does she even, and say he was a tech guy at, at a company or vice versa. How do they even start the conversation? Who do they hire? What kind of do you find that do you find that the employment attorneys are now having to become like um, more technologically savvy in order to support the contracts, these employment contracts that are being disputed?
I think they will need to become more AI and technologically savvy. I have not heard of any disputes yet related to AI avatars or synthetic personas, but I can just see how this will, and many experts have predicted how this will become a source of disputes. So, absolutely, I think employment attorneys will need to understand this space. Some of it will require, experimentation with how we deal with these matters, because obviously you and I both know the regulation is not able to keep up with how fast the technology is moving. So we
It's
may not
mind-boggling.
have the laws and the regulations to govern these things. And so a lot of it will come down to how employers want to treat these matters. And this will be a real test, I think, of organizational values and what they value, and how they treat their employees, including how they treat their personas after the employee has passed, for example.
Or whether they even include the family or the estate involved. I mean, it ends up being, it feels like it ends up being like another unclaimed asset, or an asset that the estate, the family, the whoever the beneficiaries are, they might not even know exists.
Yes, most people think of estate planning as the place where these questions get handled, and that makes sense. Estate planning does anticipate death or incapacitation, but it's largely, as you and I have talked about, right? It's largely static and transactional. So it answers questions like who inherits what or who gets access when something happens. But what it doesn't address well is ongoing behavior. So digital identity, data, AI representations, they don't just sit there waiting to be transferred. They can continue to speak and interact and persuade
Oh,
and even make decisions. And that's why this is really a governance issue and not an estate issue. So governance asks a different set of questions, which is who is allowed to represent someone digitally? What authority does that representation have? And where are the limits? Who is accountable if harm occurs? And how are those decisions reviewed over time? So when we as individuals and also enterprises treat digital assets and AI representations as an afterthought, they end up with sort of unmanaged proxies. So you can have a system that can act like someone without clear rules or responsibility. And that's when trust breaks down, incentives, drift toward engagement, perhaps over care. When we talk about things like grief bots, and families are perhaps forced to make high stakes decisions under emotional pressure. And so I think estate planning prepares us for the fact of death or incapacitation, whereas digital governance, I believe, prepares us for the consequences.
but still. I mean, part of the problem, at least where I sit, is that because death has been a taboo topic, that people don't even want to step into, do they have a trust or will, much less, oh, and by the way, you need to look at your employee contracts now while you're alive,
Mhm.
because there could be implications in there from your likeness, your avatar, just being alive and being an employee. You're building that digital legacy, even knowing you're not gone. That data is already being collected. I am, again, kind of blown away by this conversation. Um, it's just opening up so many new dimensions and conversations. So all right, just to get my head kind of now, what are you doing personally? Like, what is your recommendation? As an employee, there are a lot of people out there that are looking for jobs, specifically tech jobs, that have, subject matter experts, companies that are now building their AI team, right? So human driven AI teams to support. As an employee looking for a new job, what should I be looking for when it comes to signing those agreements?
I would look for any clauses in your employment offer or contract that have to do with AI representations of your persona, AI avatars, synthetic personas. If there isn't any information in there on that topic, and you anticipate that your employer will use your likeness to create content, to extract knowledge from you, etc., and you've learned about that in the interview process, ask questions. Ask them what data will be collected, how it will be used, what rights you will have, whether you will own your likeness, and how your likeness will continue to be used if you, for example, leave the company, or in the case of death or incapacitation, and have conversations with your loved ones about this. So most people assume consent is obvious because they're thinking like, my spouse will handle this or my kids will handle it. But I mean, this, right? And but
I
interactive
I
identity.
could barely handle just funeral arrangements, much less now I have to get into
Exactly. Yes.
their
Yes. And think about, do you really want your digital legacy to be out there without you being able to at least inform how it will be shaped? Interactive identity systems introduce conflicting stakeholders and new kinds of harm. So, control, I think, should be separated into three rights: the right to represent, like likeness, voice, style. So, who can create or deploy something that looks or sounds like you? That's the right to represent. The right to act, meaning decision making, transactions, right? Who can let your avatar sign, agree, post, authorize, or advise? And the right to train. So, how is your data used to improve and train AI models, for example? So, who can feed your messages, recordings, behaviors, etc., into a system, and for what purposes? And the reason I say that is, you mentioned my article at the beginning of this call. In that article, I talked about companies like Silicon Intelligence in China and now Two-Way in the US that are creating these sort of grief bots, right? Where they take uh, memories, video, data,
likeness.
text messages of your loved ones,
Right.
and input them into the AI, which then creates an avatar of them. And now empathy has become a product. So you can now talk to these avatars, and many of them are designed for engagement. So they want to keep you on the app so that you are talking to your deceased loved ones. And that can also complicate the grieving process. And
Thank you.
so you should be having these conversations with your loved ones very openly, because you should be thinking about whether you want them to move on or whether you want them to be stuck in this cycle of grief, because they decided to use an avatar of you to help them in that process. So these are very complicated questions. These are very human questions, and I know they can be very difficult topics, but I would encourage everyone to have these conversations with their family members.
There's this new, I don't know, new concept, but there's what digital consent. Do I digitally consent? So if grandma is in hospice and she's not gone, but I'm now taking videos of her and asking her about her childhood and upbringing and gathering data about her life, do I need to ask and get her to consent that, oh, grandma, when you're gone, I'm going to take all this data that I just gathered from you and I'm going to put it into somebody else's platform so I can continue to engage with you when you're gone. And that's just the data piece. Now let's get to the human. Now, if I actually had you on a panel right now with some grief experts, this would be a hot conversation.
Or ethicists.
And ethicists.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is when we need to set this conversation up, because from an HR standpoint, from a death tech development standpoint, from an from an ethical standpoint, bioethics, digital consent. Your thoughts on that?
I don't have an answer per se, but you are asking the right question. So, in the case of these companies like Silicon Intelligence, for example, they are relying on family consent. But what does that mean? So, in the case of grandma, you may have two of her grandchildren or more of her grandchildren disagreeing on how her data should be used. And should we take our memories and stories about her and feed them into some AI system? Because, again, these avatars are not static. They continue to speak for the human they represent. And as you and I both know, AI, there is something called model drift in AI. I've experienced it, for example, when I create a custom GPT and I don't keep it updated with the latest information and data, it kind of tends to become outdated. And then it can either hallucinate or give me incorrect information. And so these AI avatars, when they don't have continuous, new data keeping them up to date, could veer into territory that may be weird or uncomfortable for even for the end users of these avatars. And
Right.
so we need to think about this sort of identity drift, because a conversational avatar doesn't merely replay history, it's sort of generating new language. That means that the person can start saying things that they would have never said. And so, are you ready for that? So, we've moved from preservation to authorship, and that's a moral boundary that we need to think about. We
Uh-huh.
also need to think about authority inflation. So people increasingly treat, machine outputs as credible. There has been research showing that uh, people think of AI answers to ethical dilemmas as more virtuous and trustworthy. Uh, so you're mistaking AI for a principled being. That should make us all kind of sit up and pause. And I think there's relational capture. So once the interaction is ongoing, the relationship itself becomes something that a company can design and monetize and optimize for engagement. So again, going back to the case of grandma, if her granddaughter is having a conversation with the grandma's avatar and telling the avatar, for example, that she's going to go on vacation, that granddaughter might start to see ads for luggage because
Wow.
she mentioned a vacation. Are we really comfortable with that? So I think that is really where the ethical jump is that archives don't compete with real life, but our interactive selves can. And that changes autonomy, attachment, and even what we consider authentic connection.
My goodness, like I said, I think you and I just opened up a can of worms. As excited as people are with and companies and productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, with these AI agents and the technology, but there's a humanistic aspect that we need to just take a pause on. And again, government, governance, eh, compliance, legislation, I don't know where we're going to end up if we're going to be able to maintain and keep up with everything that's going on. If there were 2 to 3 takeaways that our listeners can at least start to think about or consider, what is your recommendation here?
So I think for individuals, I would say start treating your digital identity like a financial asset or a moral asset. So decide who can represent you, who can act for you, who can train on you, train on your data, and write it down. When it comes to employers and HR leaders, I would say the biggest mistake employers and HR leaders can make right now is treating AI, identity, avatars, etc., as edge cases. They're not. They're early signals, I think, of a much larger shift. We've spent decades building systems to manage access, performance, and data, but not representation. And as AI starts to speak and even decide and act and empathize on behalf of people, organizations will inherit risks that they never consciously accepted or thought about unless they act now. So my takeaway for HR leaders would be human-centric AI does not mean softer or ineffective technology. It means clearer governance. It means deciding in advance who AI can represent, where authority starts and stops, how accountability works, and what dignity looks like when technology kind of intersects with things like vulnerability and human connection. So if HR wants to remain a steward of trust and we want to remain kind of the default ethicists of our organizations, which is a role we've been playing for a while, then this is our moment to kind of step forward, not after something breaks, but before it sort of becomes normalized.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. For people who are interested in learning more about you and what you're doing, how can they find you? Best place?
Of course, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Malvika Jethmalani, or you can visit my website, atvisgroup.com. That's atvisgroup.com.
And with that, we'll end here. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.